An unmarked jade envelope lands on Nero Wolfe's desk. Nothing is accidental. Welcome to the Silent Clue Works. I am your host, Echo of Silence. Comment where you're listening from. Your voices matter. Let's begin. The case that would come to occupy Wolfe's attention for the better part of November began on a Tuesday morning when I was pretending to organize the petty cash drawer and actually wondering if Fritz's plan for lunch could be improved with strategic interference. It was 10:45, which meant Wolfe was upstairs in the plant rooms communing with his orchids and would remain there until 11, barring earthquake or the arrival of a check large enough to pay for his beer through Christmas. The doorbell rang with the kind of insistence that suggested either genuine emergency or someone who had never learned that Nero Wolfe's schedule was not subject to negotiation. I let it ring twice more, partly to give the caller time to reconsider, and partly because interrupting Wolfe during orchid time required either excellent reasons or a willingness to duck flying objects. Through the one-way glass, I could see a woman, maybe 35, with the kind of composure that comes from years of handling other people's crises professionally. I opened the door and she stepped in, bringing with her the October chill and an air of controlled urgency that made me revise my estimate of her problem upward from missing jewelry to something more substantial. She said her name was Eleanor Morrison and she needed to see Nero Wolfe immediately about a matter involving theft, blackmail, and what she called institutional sabotage. When I explained that Wolfe was unavailable until 11, she said she would wait, but added that every minute of delay increased the risk of a scandal that would destroy not just her career, but the cultural institution she had spent 8 years building. I showed her to the office and took my position behind my desk where I could keep an eye on her while appearing to work. She sat in the red leather chair with a kind of stillness that suggested military training or years of board meetings. Her hands folded over a slim portfolio that she held like it contained either salvation or damnation. At exactly 11 o'clock, the elevator descended and Wolfe entered, massive and deliberate, carrying the day's orchid selection for his desk vase. He settled into his chair, arranged the flowers with the precision of a man who believes that small rituals prevent large chaos, and only then acknowledged our visitor with the slight nod he reserves for people who have not yet proved they deserve his attention. Eleanor Morrison opened her portfolio and removed an envelope unlike anything I had seen before. It was made of some kind of treated paper that had the color and translucence of pale jade, sealed with dark green wax that bore an intricate design. She said that 3 days ago, this envelope had been delivered to her office at the Meridian Institute, a private foundation that funded archaeological preservation projects throughout the Americas. Inside was a single sheet containing accusations that someone within the Institute's 5-member board of directors had been systematically looting artifacts from sponsored dig sites and selling them through private dealers. The letter provided specific dates, locations, and transaction amounts that suggested intimate knowledge of the Institute's operations. Wolfe asked if she had investigated the claims, and she said she had spent the past 3 days verifying every detail. The accusations were false, but disturbingly well-informed. Someone with access to confidential files had constructed an elaborate fiction using real data from legitimate transactions. Yesterday, a second jade envelope had arrived, containing photographs of artifacts that had indeed been sold privately, but legally and with full board approval to fund emergency preservation work in Guatemala. She said the timing was catastrophic because the Institute's annual symposium was scheduled for next week, bringing together donors, government officials, and academic partners who controlled funding for the next 5 years. If these accusations became public, even their refutation would not prevent the kind of scandal that would destroy the Institute's credibility permanently. She needed to know who was sending the envelopes and why, and she needed to know before the symposium began. Wolfe examined the envelope without opening it, his fingers tracing the unusual paper and the wax seal. He asked who had access to the Institute's files, and she provided a list of 8 people, including the 5 board members, 2 administrative assistants, and the head archivist. He asked about enemies, competitors, or disgruntled former employees, and she said the Institute's work was collaborative rather than competitive, making professional jealousy unlikely. The wax seal, Wolfe observed, bore the crest of a European banking family that had been extinct for 40 years, and the envelope material was a synthetic polymer developed in the 1930s for diplomatic correspondence, rare and expensive. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to create not just accusations, but an atmosphere of historical significance and authenticity. He told Elena Morrison that he would consider the case, but first he needed complete financial records for the past 2 years, detailed personnel files for everyone with access to confidential information, and a list of every artifact transaction the Institute had conducted. She said she could provide everything by evening and asked what his fee would be. He quoted his standard rate, and she agreed without hesitation, which told me either that the Institute had serious money or that she was desperate enough to mortgage her future. After she left, Wolfe sat staring at the jade envelope, turning it slowly in his hands. He said that someone with intimate knowledge of the Institute was using that knowledge as a weapon, but the weapon was designed to wound rather than destroy, suggesting personal rather than professional motives. The elaborate presentation indicated someone who appreciated theater and had both the resources and patience to stage a complex performance. I asked if he was taking the case, and he said that someone had violated the sanctity of an institution devoted to preserving the past, using lies built on truth to threaten its future. Such precision in malice, he said, required investigation. He told me to call Saul Panzer and have him begin background checks on the 8 people with access to the Institute's files. The game, as they say, was afoot. By 6 o'clock that evening, Elena Morrison had delivered 3 boxes of files that transformed my desk into what looked like the aftermath of an explosion in a filing cabinet. Wolfe regarded the cardboard containers with the enthusiasm of a man asked to audit his own tax returns, but he instructed me to organize the personnel files by hierarchy before he would dignify them with his attention. The 8 people with access to the Institute's confidential files made for an interesting collection. 5 board members, 2 administrative assistants, and the head archivist. Dinner was brook trout with almond butter, which meant no discussion of jade envelopes or institutional sabotage until we returned to the office at 9. Wolfe settled into his chair and began reading with that terrifying concentration of his that makes you think he's just skimming until he starts quoting footnotes from memory 3 weeks later. While he absorbed financial records and personnel evaluations, I reviewed the background information Saul Panzer had called in during the afternoon. The board members were a study in contrasts. Harold Torrance, the attorney we had met earlier, specialized in non-profit law and had been with the Institute since its founding. Victor Lascelles, the executive director, brought business experience from the museum world, but had joined only 2 years ago. The other 3 were Dr. Margaret Chen, a preservation specialist who served as treasurer, James Cordell, whose family foundation provided significant funding, and Dr. Sophia Brennan, an expert in pre-Columbian cultures who handled academic partnerships. The staff presented their own intrigues. Patricia Vance had been executive assistant for 6 years and handled all confidential correspondence. Thomas Riley managed grant applications and donor relations, working closely with board members on sensitive financial matters. The head archivist was Dr. Martin Ashford, a meticulous scholar who maintained the Institute's research library and artifact documentation. According to Saul's preliminary report, Ashford had accumulated significant gambling debts 3 years ago that had been mysteriously resolved around the time he received a salary increase. At 10:30 the next morning, Harold Torrance arrived for his scheduled interview. He settled into the red leather chair with the careful precision of a man who bills by the quarter hour, and began defending the Institute's practices before Wolfe had asked a single question. The accusations in the Jade envelopes, he insisted, were not just false but deliberately constructed to exploit legitimate transactions in ways that made them appear suspicious to anyone unfamiliar with non-profit accounting procedures. Wolfe asked about the specific artifacts mentioned in the second envelope, and Torrance explained that 3 years ago the Institute had faced an emergency in Guatemala, where a recently discovered temple complex was threatened by illegal logging. The government lacked funds for immediate protection, so the board had authorized the private sale of duplicate artifacts from their research collection to raise money quickly. The sales were legal, documented, and approved by all relevant authorities, but someone had photographed the artifacts and presented them as if they were stolen goods being laundered through private dealers. I asked who knew about the Guatemala situation, and Torrance said the entire board had been involved in the decision, along with Patricia Vance, who handled the paperwork, and Martin Ashford, who documented the artifacts. The sales had been conducted through a reputable dealer in Boston who specialized in pre-Columbian materials. Wolfe asked if anyone had objected to the sales, and Torrance admitted that Sophia Brennan had argued against it initially, believing they should seek emergency funding through traditional channels, but she had ultimately voted with the majority. After Torrance left, Wolfe sat in silence for several minutes, his eyes closed and his lips moving in the slight push-pull rhythm that meant he was processing information at high speed. He said that whoever was behind the Jade envelopes understood not just the Institute's operations, but the psychology of scandal. They had chosen accusations that were technically false, but emotionally resonant, the kind of charges that would require extensive explanation to refute and would leave residual suspicion even after refutation. Dr. Margaret Chen arrived at 2 o'clock and brought with her the kind of precise financial mind that makes numbers confess secrets they never intended to reveal. She was compact and efficient, with reading glasses on a silver chain and the manner of someone who believes that accounting irregularities are moral failures. She said she had spent the past 3 days auditing every transaction mentioned in the Jade envelopes and found no discrepancies whatsoever. Wolfe asked about internal dynamics among the board members, and Chen said they functioned well despite occasional disagreements about funding priorities. Victor Lascelles sometimes pushed for expensive administrative improvements that she considered unnecessary. James Cordell occasionally wanted to fund projects that lacked academic rigor but had emotional appeal. Sophia Brennan advocated for research grants that produced knowledge but not tangible preservation results. These were normal tensions in any organization that balanced idealism with practical constraints. I asked if she had noticed any unusual behavior from staff members recently, and Chen said Patricia Vance had seemed distracted for the past month, making small errors in correspondence and missing details in board meeting minutes. Thomas Riley had been working late more frequently, supposedly preparing for the symposium. Martin Ashford had requested additional security measures for the archive room, claiming he had noticed files being accessed outside normal working hours. After Chen departed, Wolfe instructed me to have Saul investigate Patricia Vance's recent activities, Thomas Riley's after-hours work, and any security incidents at the Institute's offices. He said that someone with access to confidential files had been using that access for purposes beyond their normal duties, and the pattern of small disruptions suggested reconnaissance rather than simple curiosity. At 10 o'clock that evening, long after Wolfe's sacred dinner hour, the doorbell rang with the kind of desperate insistence that suggested either genuine emergency or complete ignorance of household protocol. Through the one-way glass, I could see a thin man clutching a briefcase and looking over his shoulder at the empty street like he expected pursuit. I recognized him from the personnel photographs, Dr. Martin Ashford, the head archivist. I opened the door and he practically stumbled into the hall, whispering that he knew Elena Morrison had hired Nero Wolfe, and he had information that couldn't wait until morning. When I ushered him into the office, Wolfe looked up from a financial report with the kind of irritation that could freeze beer in July. Ashford stood gripping the back of the red leather chair, his knuckles white, and stammered that he hadn't sent the envelopes, but he knew where the jade paper had come from. He said that 3 months ago, during an inventory of the Institute's basement storage area, he had found a box of old diplomatic stationery that had belonged to the Institute's founder. The paper was the same synthetic polymer used for the Jade Envelopes, manufactured in the 1930s for European diplomatic correspondence. He had catalogued the box and stored it in a secure area, but yesterday, after the first Jade envelope appeared, he had gone back to check. The box was missing. Wolfe asked why he hadn't reported this to Elena Morrison immediately, and Ashford's face went grey. He admitted that he had been considering taking a few sheets for his own calligraphy hobby, though he swore he never actually took any. He had moved the box to a less secure shelf where he could access it more easily, and now he was terrified that the board would discover his intentions and use him as a scapegoat for the entire situation. I asked who else knew about the box, and Ashford said that to his knowledge, only one person could have seen him move it. James Cordell, who had come to the storage area that same day to inspect a recent artifact donation. Wolfe listened with his eyes half closed, his fingers drumming silently on his desk blotter. After Ashford left, sweating and looking no more reassured than when he had arrived. Wolfe said that we now had confirmation that the threat was internal and that the perpetrator had a taste for using the Institute's own history as a weapon. The use of the founder's stationery was more than practical convenience, Wolfe observed. It was a symbolic stroke that implied the current board had betrayed the original mission. Someone with intimate knowledge of the Institute's past was constructing an elaborate performance designed to destroy its future, and they had chosen their materials with the care of a master craftsman. The Jade Envelopes were not just threats, but artifacts in their own right, created by someone who understood that presentation could be as powerful as content. I checked the front door locks twice before going to bed that night and made sure the mail slot was secure. The feeling in the brownstone had changed subtly, the way air pressure shifts before a storm. Somewhere in the city, the next Jade envelope was waiting to be delivered, and Wolfe's prediction about escalation felt less like speculation and more like certainty. The game had moved beyond simple blackmail into something more personal and more dangerous, and whoever was playing it had just demonstrated that they knew exactly where Nero Wolfe lived. The morning after Martin Ashford's nervous confession brought a development that transformed the case from professional intrigue to personal affront. At 8:30, while Wolfe was still upstairs with his orchids, and I was contemplating whether Fritz's breakfast eggs could be improved by strategic interference, the doorbell rang with a particular insistence that suggests either genuine emergency or complete disregard for civilized scheduling. Through the one-way glass, I could see our regular postman, but he was carrying something that made my stomach tighten. A pale jade envelope addressed to Nero Wolfe in the same elegant script we had come to associate with institutional sabotage. Fritz brought the envelope to Wolfe's room along with the morning coffee, and I was summoned upstairs with the kind of urgency usually reserved for discovering that the beer supply had been contaminated. Wolfe sat propped against his pillows, the jade envelope unopened on the breakfast tray, his face showing the particular blend of curiosity and irritation that meant someone had just made a serious tactical error. He said that by delivering the envelope directly to the brownstone, the perpetrator had crossed the line between professional harassment and personal invasion. The distinction might seem trivial to most people, but anyone who knew Wolfe understood that threatening his sanctuary was considerably more dangerous than threatening his bank account. Inside the envelope was a small obsidian blade, clearly ancient and undoubtedly valuable, wrapped in a typed note stating that this artifact had been removed from the Institute's secure archive to demonstrate how easily their security could be breached. The blade was accompanied by a photograph showing the empty display case from which it had been taken, along with a timestamp proving the theft had occurred sometime during the previous evening. The message was unmistakable. Whoever was behind the jade envelopes could not only access confidential files, but physically remove items from supposedly secure locations at will. Wolfe descended to the office at 9 instead of his usual 9:30, which told me he was taking the personal delivery more seriously than he cared to admit. He instructed me to visit the Meridian Institute immediately and examine the basement storage area where the founder's stationery had been kept, paying particular attention to access routes and security measures. While I conducted that reconnaissance, he would interview Patricia Vance about her recent financial difficulties and any unusual contacts she might have had with outsiders. The Institute's basement storage proved to be a security specialist's nightmare. The climate-controlled room was accessible through 3 different routes: the main elevator, a service stairway that connected to the building's rear entrance, and an emergency exit that opened directly onto the alley behind the building. The cage containing sensitive archival materials could be unlocked by at least 4 different keys, and Martin Ashford admitted that temporary access had been granted to various researchers over the years without rigorous tracking of key returns. I found the gap where the founder's stationery box had been stored, a space between 2 containers of catalogued correspondence that showed clear evidence of recent disturbance. More interesting was a faint trail of scuffed footprints leading from the cage area to the emergency exit, suggesting regular use rather than a single dramatic theft. The exit door was unlocked and led to a service corridor that connected directly to the rear alley, providing an unmonitored route between the street and the archive storage. Patricia Vance was waiting in Elena Morrison's office when I returned upstairs, her usual efficiency replaced by barely controlled anxiety. When I asked about her recent activities, she hesitated just long enough to make it significant, then revealed something that changed the entire complexion of the case. 3 months ago, she said, she had been approached by a woman claiming to be a journalist, researching non-profit management practices for a foundation trade publication. They had met 3 times over coffee, during which Vance had answered detailed questions about the Institute's decision-making processes, financial oversight procedures, and internal communications. The journalist had been professional and charming, taking handwritten notes but never recording their conversations. She had identified herself as working for a publication called Foundation Quarterly, but when Vance later tried to locate the magazine, it did not exist. The woman had been particularly interested in the Guatemala artifact sales, asking about board discussions, documentation procedures, and any disagreements among members about the decision. Vance provided a description. Woman in her 30s, dark hair worn in a professional style, slight accent that might have been European, expensive but conservative clothing, and a manner that suggested academic background. They had met at 3 different coffee shops near the Institute, always during Vance's lunch hour, and the woman had always arrived first and chosen seats with clear views of the entrance. When I asked why she had not reported this contact when the jade envelopes first appeared, Vance broke down completely. She said she had been terrified that admitting her mistake would cost her job and destroy her reputation in the non-profit world. She had spent 6 years building trust with the board, and one moment of naivety had potentially compromised everything the Institute represented. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened to my report with his eyes closed and his lips compressed into the thin line that meant he was processing information at maximum speed. When I finished, he said that we now had confirmation the threat was not spontaneous, but had been carefully orchestrated over months. Someone had conducted systematic reconnaissance, gathering detailed intelligence about the Institute's operations, relationships, and vulnerabilities before launching the Jade Envelope campaign. The use of Patricia Vance as an unwitting source was particularly sophisticated, Wolfe observed. By posing as a journalist and focusing on transparency and good governance, the perpetrator had obtained detailed information about internal processes, while actually encouraging Vance to be more forthcoming than she might have been with a direct questioner. The 3-month interval between the interviews and the first envelope suggested careful planning and patient execution. At 6 o'clock, as Wolfe was settling into his pre-dinner beer, the telephone rang with a call that added another layer of complexity to an already intricate situation. Elena Morrison reported that the obsidian blade's theft had been discovered when the Institute's insurance inspector arrived for a routine evaluation. The blade was part of a matched set of ceremonial knives, and its removal had been accomplished with surgical precision, suggesting someone with detailed knowledge of the display case's locking mechanism and alarm system. More disturbing was her additional news. Victor Lascelles had failed to appear for a scheduled meeting with potential donors, and his assistant had been unable to reach him since the previous evening. His apartment superintendent reported that his car was missing from the building's garage, and there were signs that he had left quickly, possibly during the night. Whether his disappearance was connected to the Jade Envelopes or represented a separate crisis remained to be determined. Wolfe set down his beer with the deliberate care of a man who has just been informed that dinner will be delayed indefinitely. He said that Lascelles' disappearance suggested either guilt or fear, and that either possibility required immediate investigation. He instructed me to have Saul Panzer begin surveillance on the remaining board members, and to arrange interviews with James Cordell and Sophia Brennan for the following morning. The Jade Envelope artist had just demonstrated that they could strike at will, and Wolfe was not inclined to wait passively for the next move in what was rapidly becoming a very personal game. The following morning brought the kind of systematic interrogation that Wolfe orchestrates like a conductor leading a particularly complex symphony. James Cordell arrived at 10 o'clock sharp, bringing with him the casual confidence of inherited wealth and the slight impatience of a man accustomed to having his time treated as more valuable than other people's problems. He settled into the red leather chair and immediately launched into a defense of his family's contributions to the Institute, as if anticipating accusations that had not yet been made. Wolfe let him establish his credentials before asking a single, precisely targeted question about the founder's stationery. Cordell's reaction was immediate and revealing, a 3-second pause followed by a laugh that sounded rehearsed. He admitted seeing Martin Ashford moving boxes in the basement storage area 3 months earlier, but claimed he had been focused on examining colonial-era maps that his family foundation had helped acquire. The founder's stationery had caught his attention only because his grandfather had known the old man personally and had occasionally mentioned the elaborate paper he used for important correspondence. When I asked what he remembered specifically about the boxes Ashford had been handling, Cordell provided details that suggested closer observation than he initially claimed. One box had been labeled with the founder's name and a date from the 1930s. Another had contained what appeared to be official seals and wax stamps. Ashford had seemed nervous about being observed, moving the boxes quickly from their original location to a less secure shelf where they would be more easily accessible. Wolfe pressed him about tensions among the board members, and Cordell's carefully maintained composure developed hairline cracks. Victor Lascelles, he said, had been pushing for changes that would transform the Institute from a focused preservation organization into something more commercial and less academically rigorous. Lascelles wanted corporate sponsorships, traveling exhibitions, and partnerships with archaeological tourism companies. The resistance had been led primarily by Sophia Brennan, who considered such proposals a betrayal of the Institute's scholarly mission. The conflict had intensified recently when Lascelles proposed selling the Institute's research library to a private collector who would digitize the materials and make them available through a subscription service. Margaret Chen had calculated the financial benefits, but Brennan had threatened resignation if the proposal moved forward. The board had tabled the discussion, but the underlying tension remained unresolved and increasingly bitter. After Cordell departed, Wolfe sat motionless for several minutes, processing information with the intensity of a man solving equations in his head. He observed that Lascelles' commercial ambitions and the Jade Envelope accusations formed an interesting parallel. Both involved transforming the Institute's mission in ways that would benefit certain interests while compromising others. Sophia Brennan arrived at 2 o'clock and immediately challenged the entire premise of private investigation in matters involving cultural preservation. She was in her mid-50s, with the intellectual intensity that makes ordinary conversation feel like a graduate seminar, and the moral certainty that comes from 30 years of fighting for principles in a pragmatic world. Wolfe responded by asking her to explain the philosophical differences between preserving artifacts in secure storage versus making them accessible through controlled sales that funded additional preservation work. Her 20-minute response revealed not just her expertise, but her passion for the Institute's mission. When she finally paused, Wolfe asked whether her opposition to Lascelles' proposals might have motivated someone to frame the entire board as corrupt. The question hit like a physical blow. Brennan gripped the chair arms and revealed something she had kept secret for 3 weeks, an anonymous email threatening that if she continued blocking Lascelles' initiatives, information would be released that would destroy not just his reputation, but the entire Institute's credibility. She had dismissed it as an empty threat from someone who did not understand academic politics, but now realized the Jade envelopes might represent the fulfillment of that warning. The email had come from a generic service and had been written in formal, almost archaic English that suggested either a non-native speaker or someone deliberately affecting an old-fashioned style. It had referenced the founder's vision and suggested that current leadership had betrayed that vision through compromise and commercialization. I asked why she had not reported the threat, and her answer revealed the particular pressures of academic culture. Acknowledging intimidation would have been interpreted as weakness or paranoia, potentially undermining her credibility in future board discussions. She had deleted the email immediately, which was probably the only impulsive decision she had made in years. After Brennan left, Wolfe instructed me to have Saul investigate Lascelles' recent activities more thoroughly. That evening, Saul reported that Lascelles had been seen at a private storage facility in Queens, accessing a unit rented under his mother's maiden name. The timing coincided with the obsidian blade theft, creating either incriminating evidence or an elaborate frame. More interesting was Saul's discovery that Lascelles had recently been in contact with a European art dealer who specialized in pre-Columbian artifacts and maintained offices in Lisbon. The European connection deepened when Saul provided security footage from LaGuardia showing Lascelles meeting a woman near the international terminal. The images were frustratingly indistinct, but the woman's professional appearance and confident manner suggested someone accustomed to conducting business in airport lounges. A partially visible departures board showed flights to Zurich, Berlin, and Lisbon, while background details revealed a boutique travel agency that specialized in heritage tours and private collector services. At 6 o'clock, Elena Morrison called with news that shifted the investigation into higher gear. A fourth Jade envelope had arrived, containing photographs of Lascelles meeting with a known dealer in questionable antiquities. The photographs were dated 3 weeks earlier and showed him examining what appeared to be pre-Columbian gold work in a Boston gallery. Accompanying bank records indicated a $50,000 deposit into an account bearing his name, dated 2 days after the photographed meeting. Wolfe listened with his eyes closed, breathing slowly and deliberately. When Morrison finished, he said we were dealing with someone who understood not just institutional politics, but human psychology at a sophisticated level. The Jade envelope artist had escalated from vague accusations to specific evidence, from threatening the institution to destroying individuals, and had timed each revelation for maximum psychological impact. He instructed Morrison to secure all remaining artifacts and restrict archive access to essential personnel only. The perpetrator was working toward a specific goal, and until we understood that objective, every defensive measure would be reactive rather than preventive. The next envelope would likely arrive within 48 hours and would probably target another board member, continuing the systematic destruction of the Institute's leadership. I asked Wolfe if he had formed a theory about the mastermind's identity, and he said that theories without evidence were intellectual exercises rather than investigative tools. What we knew with certainty was that someone with intimate institutional knowledge, access to confidential files, and sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation was systematically destroying an organization devoted to preserving the past. The irony, he observed, was probably intentional, suggesting that the perpetrator's motivation was as much philosophical as practical. As we moved toward the dining room for Fritz's carefully timed dinner, I could not escape the feeling that somewhere in the city, the next Jade Envelope was already prepared and waiting for delivery. The game had moved beyond simple blackmail into something more personal and more dangerous, and whoever was orchestrating it had just demonstrated their willingness to destroy individual reputations to achieve their larger goal. The question was no longer who had access to the Institute's secrets, but who had the sophistication and patience to weaponize those secrets with such devastating precision. The morning after Martin Ashford's nervous confession brought a development that elevated the case from professional harassment to personal warfare. At 7:30, while Wolfe was still upstairs with his orchids and I was contemplating whether Fritz's breakfast eggs required strategic intervention, the doorbell rang with the particular insistence that suggests either genuine emergency or complete disregard for civilized scheduling. Through the one-way glass, I could see our regular postman, but he was carrying something that made my stomach tighten. A pale jade envelope addressed to Archie Goodwin in the same elegant script we had come to associate with institutional sabotage. Inside was a photograph of me entering the Institute's basement storage area the previous day, taken from an angle that suggested surveillance from the service corridor. The accompanying note, typed on the familiar synthetic paper, stated that private investigators interfering in internal institutional matters would find themselves implicated in whatever scandals emerged. The threat was unsubtle and probably empty, but the surveillance itself was significant. Someone had been watching the Institute closely enough to document my visit within hours of its occurrence, and they wanted me to know it. Wolfe descended from the plant rooms 15 minutes early, his face showing the particular combination of curiosity and controlled fury that meant someone had just made a serious miscalculation about the limits of his tolerance. He examined the photograph with the intensity he usually reserves for rare orchid specimens, noting the camera angle, lighting conditions, and background details. The shot had been taken from approximately 15 feet away, using professional equipment, and the timestamp showed the photographer had been positioned and ready before my arrival. But the personal threat to me was merely the opening movement in what proved to be a more comprehensive violation. At 9 o'clock, when Wolfe returned from his morning routine with the orchids, he carried not his usual calm, but a frown that suggested someone had tracked mud onto sacred ground. He announced that something in the plant rooms had been moved. Not damaged, not stolen, but moved. A brass misting nozzle that had hung from the same hook for 8 years was now on a shelf, and a ledger from the north room had been shifted 3 inches from its usual position. If you think that sounds trivial, you have never lived with Nero Wolfe. The plant rooms are as inviolable to him as a cathedral, and any unauthorized alteration ranks somewhere between blasphemy and armed assault. The only people with legitimate access were himself, Theodore Horstman, and me, and none of us had moved those items. Theodore had noticed nothing unusual when he arrived at 8, but admitted the objects might have been moved after his final check the previous evening. Wolfe's analysis was immediate and chilling. The intrusion was not random, but demonstration. Someone had entered his sanctum, moved objects that only he would notice, and left without taking anything. The purpose was not theft, but a message, showing that locks and routines could be bypassed at will. The obsidian blade taken from the Institute and the nozzle moved in the plant rooms were variations on the same theme, violations of supposedly secure spaces designed to prove that no sanctuary was truly inviolable. At 11 o'clock, Elena Morrison arrived with Margaret Chen, bringing the sixth jade envelope and the kind of controlled panic that comes from watching your life's work dissolve in real time. This envelope contained what appeared to be an internal memorandum bearing Elena's electronic signature, authorizing a confidential evaluation of potential European partners for artifact custodianship. The document looked authentic in every detail except one. Elena swore she had never written or authorized any such memorandum. Wolfe studied the forged document with the concentration of a man reading his own death warrant. Within minutes, he had identified the base document the forger had used. A genuine memo Elena had written 18 months earlier about joint preservation projects with European institutions. Someone had taken that legitimate correspondence, altered key phrases, and produced a document that would appear to outside observers as incontrovertible evidence of planned asset liquidation. The pattern was now unmistakable and sophisticated beyond anything we had previously encountered. Our Jade Envelope artist specialized in taking authentic documents, photographs, and decisions, then twisting them just far enough to create the appearance of corruption without ever fabricating from scratch. It was a strategy designed to withstand superficial scrutiny while collapsing under rigorous examination, assuming anyone had the time or inclination to conduct such examination before the damage became irreversible. Margaret Chen confirmed that the formatting and internal style were nearly perfect matches for Elena's real correspondence. The only obvious anomaly to anyone familiar with internal nuances was a single phrase, asset optimization potential. Elena never used the word optimization in her communications. That terminology belonged to Victor Lascelles, whose business background favored corporate jargon over academic precision. At 3 o'clock, Saul Panzer called with intelligence that connected several threads into a coherent pattern. He had identified the mysterious journalist who had interviewed Patricia Vance, a woman named Christina Vega, who operated a consulting firm specializing in cultural heritage management and private collection services. Credit card records showed coffee purchases at the same 3 locations where Vance had met with her supposed interviewer, and the timeline matched perfectly. More significant was photographic evidence linking Vega to Victor Lascelles. Conference documentation from Lisbon showed them on the same panel discussing heritage access strategies, their body language suggesting familiarity beyond professional courtesy. Saul had also discovered that Vega had previously worked for a Portuguese foundation shut down following allegations of artifact trafficking, though she had never been formally charged. When Elena and Margaret departed, Wolfe remained unusually still, processing the implications of systematic reconnaissance conducted over months by someone with sophisticated understanding of both institutional dynamics and individual psychology. He observed that we were dealing with an adversary who appreciated the importance of controlled environments and understood how to violate them for maximum psychological impact. The escalation from institutional threats to personal intrusion marked a critical shift in the campaign. By targeting me directly and violating his plant rooms, the perpetrator had transformed from invisible orchestrator to active participant, and active participants made mistakes that passive observers avoided. Wolfe announced his intention to force the next phase of engagement rather than waiting for additional jade envelopes to dictate the timeline. He instructed me to arrange a meeting with all remaining board members for the following afternoon, explaining that it was time to create conditions where continued anonymity would become impossible. The systematic destruction of the Institute's leadership had been building toward some specific climax, and Wolfe intended to control both the timing and location of that climax, rather than allowing the Jade Envelope artist to maintain the initiative indefinitely. As evening approached and Fritz began his dinner preparations, the atmosphere in the brownstone had changed subtly, like air pressure shifting before a storm. Somewhere in the city, possibly in an elegant hotel room or a carefully maintained apartment. Christina Vega was preparing her next move in what had become a very personal chess match. But now, Wolfe was preparing his counter-move, and the collision between those preparations would determine whether the Meridian Institute survived as Elena Morrison had built it, or became another casualty in the intersection between cultural preservation and sophisticated revenge. The morning after the plant room violation brought the kind of methodical investigation that Wolfe orchestrates like a master craftsman assembling a complex mechanism. At 8 o'clock, while reviewing the previous day's developments over coffee, he instructed me to have Saul Panzer examine the Institute's security logs for the past month, focusing specifically on after-hours access and any patterns that might connect to the Jade Envelope timeline. The violation of his sanctuary had transformed the case from professional curiosity to personal mission, and Wolfe intended to dismantle the conspiracy with surgical precision. Saul's preliminary report arrived by 10 o'clock and revealed disturbing patterns that confirmed our suspicions about inside assistance. Martin Ashford had entered the Institute building 6 times during the past 3 weeks outside normal working hours, always claiming climate control maintenance in the archive areas. Each visit coincided with periods when confidential files had been accessed or when physical evidence had been planted or removed. More significantly, telephone records showed calls from the Institute's main number to a midtown hotel during the same time periods, suggesting coordination between internal and external actors. Elena Morrison arrived at 11 with documentation that deepened the conspiracy's apparent sophistication. Financial audits revealed that Victor Lasselle had received consulting payments from 3 different European foundations over the past 6 months, none of which had been disclosed to the board as required by conflict of interest policies. The payments totaled nearly $200,000 and had been deposited into accounts that did not appear on his required financial disclosures. When combined with the photographs showing him meeting with questionable dealers, the pattern suggested systematic financial impropriety rather than isolated lapses in judgment. But the most damaging revelation came from Patricia Vance's expanded recollection of her interviews with the mysterious journalist. Under careful questioning, she remembered that her interviewer had displayed unusually detailed knowledge of the Institute's internal procedures, asking about specific board members by name and referencing decisions that had never been made public. The woman had also shown particular interest in the founder's legacy materials and had asked pointed questions about access procedures for historical documents stored in the basement archives. Wolfe processed this information with the intensity of a man solving equations that would determine life or death. He observed that the Jade Envelope campaign represented not random harassment, but systematic preparation for a specific objective that required detailed intelligence about the Institute's vulnerabilities, personalities, and procedures. The 3-month timeline between the initial reconnaissance and the first envelope suggested careful planning and patient execution by someone with professional expertise in institutional manipulation. At 2 o'clock, Harold Torrance called with news that elevated the stakes considerably. The Institute's insurance company had received anonymous communications questioning the security of the artifact collection and suggesting that recent thefts indicated systematic problems with institutional oversight. The timing suggested coordination with the Jade Envelope campaign, designed to create maximum pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Insurance investigations could freeze operations, prevent loans against the collection, and destroy the Institute's ability to function even if the board survived the scandal. Margaret Chen arrived shortly afterward with financial analysis that revealed the true scope of the threat. If the insurance company suspended coverage or the symposium collapsed due to scandal, the Institute would face immediate cash flow problems that could force liquidation of assets within months. The endowment was substantial, but not sufficient to maintain operations without ongoing donor support, and donor confidence was precisely what the Jade Envelope campaign was designed to destroy. Wolfe announced his intention to force the conspiracy into the open through direct confrontation rather than continued passive investigation. He instructed me to arrange a full board meeting for the following afternoon, explaining that it was time to present each member with the evidence we had gathered and observe their individual reactions. The guilty parties would reveal themselves through their responses to specific accusations, while the innocent would provide information that might identify the remaining conspirators. But first, he wanted to interview Martin Ashford privately, away from the Institute and other board members. The archivist's nervous behavior and late-night activities marked him as either a primary conspirator or a coerced accomplice, and Wolfe intended to determine which before the larger confrontation. I called Ashford and arranged a meeting for 4 o'clock, explaining only that Nero Wolfe needed clarification about archive security procedures. Ashford arrived, looking like a man approaching his own execution, his hands shaking as he settled into the red leather chair. Before Wolfe could ask a single question, he broke down completely and confessed to systematic betrayal of his professional responsibilities. 3 months earlier, he revealed, a woman identifying herself as Cristina Vega had approached him with evidence of his gambling debts and threatened to expose his financial problems to the board unless he provided assistance with what she called a cultural heritage assessment. The assistance had begun with copying confidential files and providing detailed information about the Institute's security procedures. It had escalated to after-hours access for photographing documents, stealing the founder's stationery, and ultimately facilitating the theft of the obsidian blade by leaving service doors unlocked and security systems disabled. Ashford insisted he had believed Vega was conducting legitimate due diligence for potential European partners, but admitted he had suspected the true purpose when the Jade Envelopes began arriving. Wolfe asked why Ashford had not reported the coercion immediately, and the answer revealed the particular vulnerability that sophisticated blackmailers exploit. Ashford's gambling problems had been resolved through a loan from Victor Lascelles, who had presented it as institutional assistance for a valued employee. Exposing Vega's blackmail would have required admitting the gambling debts, which would have revealed Lascelles' undisclosed financial involvement with a subordinate employee. The web of compromised relationships was becoming clear. Lascelles had used his position to create dependencies and obligations that could be exploited when necessary. Ashford's financial problems, Patricia Vance's career ambitions, and even the board's internal tensions had all been systematically leveraged to create the conditions necessary for institutional destruction. After Ashford departed, visibly relieved but still terrified about his future, Wolfe sat in contemplative silence for nearly an hour. When he finally spoke, it was to observe that we were dealing with adversaries who understood that institutions are rarely destroyed by external attacks alone. They require the active or passive cooperation of those inside the walls. And the Jade Envelope campaign had been designed to turn the Institute's own strengths into weapons against itself. The sophistication of the operation suggested professional expertise in corporate acquisition or institutional restructuring. Cristina Vega was not merely a blackmailer or artifact thief, but someone with systematic experience in destroying organizations for profit. The question now was whether the remaining board members could be united quickly enough to mount an effective defense, or whether the damage was already irreversible. Saul called at 6 o'clock with intelligence that confirmed our worst suspicions. Cristina Vega was registered at the Pierre under her own name and had been meeting regularly with representatives of a Swiss investment group that specialized in acquiring distressed cultural assets. The group's previous acquisitions included museums, foundations, and archaeological sites that had been purchased at substantial discounts following scandals or financial crises. Wolfe announced that tomorrow's board meeting would determine whether the Meridian Institute survived as Elena Morrison had built it, or became another casualty in the intersection between cultural preservation and sophisticated predation. The Jade Envelope artist had revealed her true objective, and now the final phase of the battle would be fought not in shadows, but in the harsh light of direct confrontation. As Fritz began preparing dinner and the brownstone settled into its evening routine, I could not escape the feeling that somewhere in an elegant hotel room, Christina Vega was preparing for the same confrontation with equal determination and considerably more experience in destroying the kinds of institutions that civilized people spend their lives trying to build and preserve. The morning after Martin Ashford's confession brought the kind of methodical preparation that Wolfe orchestrates when he intends to end a case definitively rather than merely solve it. At 9 o'clock, while reviewing Saul Penzer's overnight surveillance report from the Pierre, he announced that the final confrontation would take place in his office that afternoon. The brownstone provided advantages that no other location could offer: controlled access, familiar territory, and the psychological weight of Wolfe's authority operating from behind his own massive desk. Elena Morrison arrived first at 2 o'clock, bringing with her the controlled tension of someone who understands that the next few hours will determine whether 8 years of careful institutional building survives or collapses into scandal and liquidation. Margaret Chen followed shortly afterward, clutching financial documents with the desperate precision of someone who believes that numbers might provide salvation where human judgment has failed. Harold Torrance settled into the red leather chair with the careful movements of a man who suspects his legal expertise may prove inadequate to the situation at hand. Sophia Brennan positioned herself near the bookshelves, radiating the controlled fury of someone who has spent weeks watching her life's work being systematically undermined by adversaries she could not identify or confront. The empty chair I had positioned for Victor Lascelles dominated the room like an accusation, and I noticed that none of the board members would look directly at that vacant space. His continued absence had moved beyond suspicious into actively incriminating, particularly given Saul's report that his hotel room had been abandoned with signs of hasty departure. Wolfe entered at exactly 2:15, settled behind his desk with the deliberate precision of a judge taking the bench, and began without preamble. He stated that the Meridian Institute had been targeted for systematic destruction by a conspiracy that combined external expertise in institutional manipulation with internal access to confidential information and security procedures. The Jade Envelope campaign represented not random harassment, but careful preparation for acquisition by interests that specialized in purchasing distressed cultural assets at substantial discounts following manufactured crises. He presented the evidence methodically, building from Martin Ashford's signed confession through the financial irregularities to the insurance company complications. Each revelation landed with the force of physical blows, and I watched the board members' faces cycle through shock, recognition, and dawning fury as the scope of the betrayal became clear. Elena Morrison went pale when Wolfe detailed how extensively her correspondence had been compromised and weaponized against the institution she had spent years building. But the most systematic dismantling was reserved for the case against Victor Lascelles. Wolfe presented the undisclosed consulting payments from European foundations, the meetings with questionable dealers documented in Saul's photographs, and the loan to Martin Ashford that had created a compromised employee within the Institute's security structure. He outlined how Lascelles had used his position to facilitate Christina Vega's reconnaissance, providing her with the institutional knowledge necessary to construct accusations that were technically false but emotionally devastating. The pattern was unmistakable and sophisticated. Lascelles had positioned himself as the essential intermediary between the Institute and its supposed salvation, presenting commercial proposals that appeared as expansion strategies but were actually preparation for the kind of restructuring that would follow acquisition by profit-focused investors. His disappearance coincided perfectly with the escalation of pressure on the remaining board members, leaving them isolated and vulnerable, while he presumably negotiated his future employment with the acquiring entity. Wolfe observed that the Jade Envelope artist had demonstrated professional expertise in psychological manipulation that exceeded anything Lascelles possessed. The systematic intelligence gathering, the careful timing of revelations, and the sophisticated understanding of institutional vulnerabilities suggested someone with extensive experience in destroying organizations for profit. At precisely 3 o'clock, as if summoned by the logic of Wolfe's presentation, the doorbell rang with a particular insistence that suggested either genuine emergency or someone accustomed to having doors opened immediately. Through the one-way glass, I could see Christina Vega matching Patricia Vance's description perfectly. Professional appearance, expensive conservative clothing, and the confident manner of someone who had conducted similar visits many times before. She entered the brownstone like she owned it, bringing with her an air of controlled authority that filled the hall. When I ushered her into the office and she saw the full board assembled, her eyes went immediately to the empty chair positioned for Lascelles, and I saw the first crack in her professional facade. Wolfe invited her to sit, but she chose to remain standing, positioning herself where she could observe all the board members simultaneously. She began by stating that she represented investors interested in partnering with the Meridian Institute to expand its mission and ensure its long-term financial stability. The Jade Envelopes, she claimed with practiced smoothness, had been sent by concerned parties who believed the current board was mismanaging valuable cultural resources and needed external oversight to prevent further deterioration. The performance was polished and confident, delivered with the assurance of someone who had successfully executed similar operations multiple times. But Wolfe interrupted her rehearsed presentation with a single question that demolished her entire strategy. Whether she had informed her Swiss investors that the Jade Envelope campaign constituted criminal conspiracy to commit fraud, extortion, and theft of cultural property under federal statutes governing the protection of archaeological materials. Vega's reaction confirmed everything we had theorized about the operation's true nature. Her professional composure shattered completely, replaced by the cold calculation of someone reassessing odds that had suddenly shifted against her. She demanded to know what evidence Wolfe possessed, and he responded by presenting Martin Ashford's signed confession detailing her coercion methods, telephone records connecting her to the Institute during after-hours intrusions, and photographic evidence linking her to Victor Lascelles in contexts that contradicted her claims of arm's-length professional relationships. Elena Morrison stood and informed Vega that the Institute would be filing criminal complaints with federal authorities within the hour, charging her with conspiracy, extortion, theft of cultural property, and fraud under statutes that carried substantial prison sentences. The insurance company had been briefed that morning about the systematic campaign to create false impressions of institutional mismanagement and had agreed to suspend their investigation pending criminal proceedings. The symposium would proceed as scheduled with full disclosure to attendees about the attempted acquisition and the board's successful defense of institutional independence. Vega's final gambit was to suggest that Victor Lascelles could provide testimony implicating other board members in various improprieties if charges were filed against her. Wolfe's response was delivered with the cold precision of a surgeon removing a malignant growth. He observed that Lascelles was currently in federal custody, having been detained at JFK Airport, attempting to board a flight to Zurich with documentation that included forged provenance records for artifacts he had planned to sell through European dealers. The game was over, and Christina Vega understood it. She left the brownstone without another word, her professional confidence replaced by the grim awareness that sophisticated conspiracies collapse rapidly once their fundamental assumptions prove false. Within hours, federal agents would be interviewing her about the Jade Envelope campaign, and her Swiss investors would be discovering that distressed cultural assets were considerably more expensive than anticipated when criminal prosecution entered the equation. After she departed, the board members sat in stunned silence. processing the reality that their institution had come within days of being destroyed by adversaries who understood that cultural preservation was vulnerable to exactly the same predatory strategies that worked against commercial enterprises. Wolfe observed that institutions devoted to preserving the past were particularly susceptible to manipulation by those who understood how to weaponize history against itself, and that eternal vigilance was not merely a philosophical principle, but a practical necessity for survival. The brownstone returned to its usual rhythm as Fritz announced that dinner would be served in 30 minutes. Wolfe nodded approval and reached for his current book, signaling that the case of the Jade Envelopes was officially closed. The threat had been neutralized, the sanctity of the Institute preserved, and most importantly, the sanctity of his own schedule restored. As I settled at my desk to type the final report, I reflected that he had once again demonstrated his particular genius for turning adversaries' own weapons against them, using their sophistication and patience to trap them in consequences of their own making. The silence that settled over the office after Christina Vega's departure carried the weight of a battlefield where the artillery has finally ceased. Elena Morrison sat gripping her portfolio with hands that trembled slightly, while Margaret Chen stared at the financial documents scattered across her lap, as if they might suddenly rearrange themselves into a more palatable reality. Harold Torrance had removed his glasses and was cleaning them with the methodical precision of a man who needs time to process the systematic destruction of assumptions he had held for years. Sophia Brennan remained standing near the bookshelves, her academic composure finally cracking to reveal the fury that had been building for weeks as she watched her life's work being undermined by adversaries she could not identify or confront. Wolfe poured beer from the bottle on his desk with the deliberate concentration he applies to all liquids, watched the foam settle to his satisfaction, and then addressed the question that was consuming the oxygen in the room. Elena Morrison asked how he had known with such certainty that Lascelles would attempt to flee and that Vega would crumble under the threat of federal prosecution. He replied that certainty in human affairs is largely mythical, but probability, when calculated with sufficient rigor and attention to character, approaches a functional equivalent for practical purposes. The Jade Envelope campaign, he explained, suffered from the fatal flaw of all over-elaborate conspiracies. It required too many distinct skill sets to be the work of a single mastermind, yet showed too much coordination to be a loose alliance of opportunists. The theatrical presentation and historical symbolism reflected a personality obsessed with the aesthetics of intellectual superiority. Someone who viewed the Institute as a stage for demonstrating cultural sophistication. That was Vega's signature. However, the specific financial targets, the corporate terminology, and the systematic manipulation of insurance procedures reflected the mind of a bureaucrat seeking to liquidate assets for maximum efficiency with minimal personal risk. That was Lascelles operating within his area of expertise. The divergence in their methods created the vulnerability Wolfe had exploited. Lascelles wanted money and a secure escape route because he was fundamentally a coward who viewed institutions as ledgers to be balanced rather than missions to be preserved. Vega wanted the prestige and satisfaction of dismantling a rival organization because she was essentially a predator who viewed cultural institutions as prey to be systematically hunted and consumed. When pressure mounted beyond their comfort levels, Lascelles would run while Vega would fight, and that predictable difference in temperament had provided the leverage necessary to destroy their alliance. At 6 o'clock, as the board members were gathering their materials to depart, the telephone rang with confirmation of Wolfe's predictions. Federal agents had indeed arrested Lascelles at JFK Airport, attempting to board a flight to Zurich with forged documentation and a briefcase containing artifact provenance records that would have facilitated European sales. Christina Vega had been taken into custody at the Pierre after a search of her suite revealed detailed surveillance photographs of Institute personnel, copies of confidential financial documents, and correspondence with Swiss investors discussing acquisition timelines and profit projections. Elena Morrison wrote a check that would keep the brownstone in orchids and beer for a considerable period, handing it to me with an expression of profound relief mixed with exhaustion. She said the institute would survive, though recovery would require months of careful relationship rebuilding with donors, insurance companies, and academic partners who had been shaken by the systematic assault on the organization's credibility. They would need to find a new executive director who understood that preservation was not an obstacle to efficiency, but the fundamental purpose that gave efficiency meaning and direction. After the front door closed behind the last departing board member, I returned to the office to find Wolfe leaning back in his chair with his eyes closed, his lips moving in the faint rhythm that indicates a man organizing his thoughts after the chaos of extended human interaction. I observed that it had been an elegant piece of detective work, particularly the bluff about federal agents already investigating Vega's European connections. Wolfe opened one eye and corrected me with characteristic precision. It had not been a bluff, but a prediction of inevitable consequences. Since Saul Panzer had contacted federal authorities that morning with evidence that made investigation unavoidable. I asked about the moved nozzle in the plant rooms, the violation that had seemed to offend him more than the theft of valuable artifacts. His expression darkened as he explained that the intrusion represented definitive proof of Vega's personal involvement and fundamental lack of respect for boundaries. Lascelles, despite his treachery, understood the brownstone's routines and knew better than to disturb the orchids. Only an outsider with the arrogance of a conqueror would dare rearrange a man's sanctuary to deliver a psychological message revealing the same hubris that led her to believe she could dismantle established institutions without facing serious consequences. Fritz appeared at that moment carrying the aromatic promise of quenelle de brochet, pike dumplings in crayfish sauce that had required 6 hours of careful preparation. The transition from detective to gourmand was instantaneous and complete. The Jade Envelopes, federal investigations, and institutional conspiracies ceased to exist in the face of immediate culinary priorities. We moved to the dining room in comfortable silence, the ritual of exceptional food taking precedence over all other concerns. The quenelles proved to be masterpieces of texture and flavor, light enough to float, yet rich enough to satisfy completely. We ate without conversation for 20 minutes, the only sounds being silverware against china and the satisfied murmurs that constitute the highest compliment Fritz can receive for his artistry. Only after coffee had been served did Wolfe permit discussion to return to the week's events, observing that the case provided a melancholy reminder of institutional fragility. Cultural organizations, he noted, are constructed from stone and endowments and scholarly traditions, but they survive only through the shared belief and commitment of the people who sustain them. When that dedication falters or is sold for consulting fees and European bank accounts, the physical assets become merely inventory awaiting liquidation. We had prevented one such transaction, but the market remained permanently open for those who understood how to convert historical significance into negotiable currency. He lifted his coffee cup and studied the surface as if reading prophecies in the liquid's depths. People like Lascelles and Vega, he said, believe themselves sophisticated because they can calculate the monetary value of irreplaceable objects. They fail to comprehend that preservation is not about hoarding artifacts, but about maintaining civilization's conversation with its own past. By attempting to sell that conversation, they silence it permanently, which he found distasteful not merely on moral grounds, but as a profound aesthetic failure representing bad manners on a historical scale. I stood to return to my desk and complete the final report that would close the file on the puzzle of the Jade Envelope. I remarked that for someone who claimed to work exclusively for financial compensation, he devoted considerable energy to defending things that could not be purchased at any price. He regarded me with the expression he reserves for my more impertinent observations. explaining that he worked for money precisely so he could afford to defend his own comfort and preferences, and if the preservation of civilization occasionally coincided with his bank balance, it represented a fortunate alignment of practical and philosophical interests rather than deliberate altruism. As I reached the office door, I looked back to see him already absorbed in his current book, a history of Byzantine administrative practices he had been neglecting for 3 days. The brownstone had returned to its proper rhythm, the orchids were secure upstairs, and the check was safely deposited. Tomorrow would bring new routines, fresh problems, and perhaps another client with mysteries that required untangling. But tonight, the only things being consumed were literature and beer. And that seemed like a perfectly reasonable way for civilization to defend itself against those who would reduce it to commodity prices and profit margins. The morning after Cristina Vega's departure should have brought the satisfaction of a case concluded, but at 9:15, the doorbell rang with a particular persistence that suggests federal authority operating on its own schedule rather than respecting the civilized rhythms of private investigation. Through the one-way glass, I could see a tall man in a government-issue overcoat carrying the kind of leather portfolio that practically announces its connection to subpoenas and federal jurisdiction. He identified himself as Special Agent Frederick Loomis from the Cultural Property Crime Unit, which was apparently a branch of federal law enforcement I had not realized existed, but which seemed entirely appropriate given recent events. His credentials looked legitimate, his manner suggested professional competence, and his request to speak with Nero Wolfe about the Meridian Institute carried the weight of someone accustomed to having doors opened immediately upon request. I brought him to the office and summoned Wolfe, who descended from the plant rooms with less reluctance than usual. The connection between cultural property crime and the Jade Envelope conspiracy had piqued his interest sufficiently to interrupt his morning routine with the orchids. He settled behind his desk, regarded Loomis with the neutral attention he reserves for federal representatives, and announced that if the government intended to complicate his breakfast schedule, they should at least provide information worth the disruption. Loomis assured him that no arrest warrants were contemplated for anyone currently residing at the brownstone address. However, Cristina Vega had made claims during her interrogation that required verification from someone with detailed knowledge of the conspiracy's development. According to a statement, she had not originated the Jade Envelope campaign but had been hired to professionalize and weaponize an existing strategy that was already in motion when she entered the picture in early September. That timeline created problems for our assumption that the same mind had planned both the initial reconnaissance and the systematic envelope campaign. Either Vega was attempting to minimize her culpability by inventing a shadowy superior, or someone else had laid the groundwork for institutional destruction, and she had simply provided the expertise necessary to complete the operation with maximum efficiency and minimum legal exposure for the primary conspirators. Wolfe requested additional details about Vega's claims, and Loomis consulted his portfolio before responding. She insisted that her contact with the conspiracy had come through an intermediary representing Swiss investment interests, someone who had approached her in Lisbon with documentation showing that the Meridian Institute was already under internal pressure from someone described as having a scholar's mind and a long memory. Her role was to transform that internal discord into complete institutional collapse that would facilitate acquisition by interests specializing in distressed cultural assets. The intermediary had been identified only as Herr Kremer, almost certainly an alias, and had demonstrated detailed knowledge of the Institute's operations, personnel, and historical vulnerabilities. More significantly, he had specifically requested that any communications use materials connected to the Institute's founding period, suggesting symbolic resonance that went beyond mere theatrical effect into personal vendetta territory. After Loomis departed, taking with him the bureaucratic atmosphere that federal agents carry like cologne, Wolfe remained unusually still for several minutes. I asked whether he believed Vega's story about the mysterious intermediary, and he replied that criminals facing substantial prison sentences often attempt to redistribute responsibility, but they rarely invent additional conspirators since that complicates plea negotiations. More likely, Vega was accurately describing her recruitment while possibly exaggerating the importance of her role in the overall operation. He sent me to retrieve the jade envelope from his desk blotter, which he had kept as a specimen of criminal artistry. Examining it again with the concentrated attention he usually reserves for rare orchid specimens, he began pointing out details that had seemed merely decorative but were actually diagnostic. The synthetic polymer paper was indeed from the 1930s, but its perfect condition proved it had been stored in professional archival conditions rather than discovered in some basement box. Only the Institute's own climate-controlled storage could have preserved the material in such pristine condition. More revealing was the wax seal bearing the crest of a European banking family. The design was intricate and impressive, conveying exactly the kind of aristocratic authority that would intimidate recipients unfamiliar with European heraldry. However, it was also historically impossible for the specific context the forger was attempting to create. The Institute's founder had been a vocal critic of that particular banking house, famously refusing to conduct business with them during the Depression. He would never have used their seal on his personal correspondence. The person who selected that seal understood European aristocracy as a generic symbol of class and authority, rather than a specific historical identifier with particular associations and enemies. That era pointed away from someone with genuine scholarly knowledge and towards someone who viewed history as a collection of impressive props rather than a discipline requiring precision and context. It was, Wolfe observed with distaste, a failure of intellectual rigor that was as incriminating as any fingerprint. At 11 o'clock, Elena Morrison called with information that deepened the historical dimension of the conspiracy. Responding to Wolfe's request for documentation of early institutional disputes, she had discovered correspondence from 15 years earlier involving a bitter academic feud with Dr. Leonard Havel, a professor of Andean studies who had accused the Institute's founder of facilitating cultural theft under the guise of preservation. The dispute had centered on a Peruvian excavation whose artifacts had been repatriated under circumstances that Havel considered ethically compromised. Havel had waged a public campaign against the Institute's practices, publishing articles with titles like Ethics and Ownership in Pre-Columbian Excavations that contained detailed footnoted attacks on the founder's methods and motivations. The campaign had ultimately backfired in academic circles, leaving the Institute's reputation mostly intact while damaging Havel's own credibility. He had been forced into early retirement and had disappeared from public academic discourse approximately 10 years ago, though there had been occasional reports of him speaking at minor conferences about heritage capitalism and institutional corruption. The connection became clearer when Elena mentioned that Martin Ashford had been recommended to the Meridian Institute by his former doctoral advisor, who had been Dr. Leonard Havel. The archivist's placement at the Institute now appeared less coincidental and more strategic, providing someone with both access to confidential materials and potential ideological sympathy for arguments about institutional betrayal of founding principles. Wolfe instructed me to have Saul Panzer investigate Havel's current activities and financial situation, particularly any connections to European investment groups or cultural heritage consulting firms. If Vega's claims about an intermediary were accurate, someone with Havel's academic credentials and documented grievances would be perfectly positioned to provide the ideological framework and historical knowledge necessary to construct a sophisticated campaign against the Institute he had spent years publicly attacking. By afternoon, the case had evolved from simple criminal conspiracy into something more complex and personally motivated. The Jade Envelopes represented not just financial opportunism, but intellectual revenge, a scholar's systematic attempt to destroy an institution he believed had betrayed its own founding principles. The Swiss investors provided money and professional expertise, but the driving force was someone who understood the Institute's history intimately enough to weaponize that knowledge against its current leadership. As Fritz began preparing dinner and the brownstone settled into its evening routine, I reflected that we were dealing with adversaries who combined academic sophistication with criminal methodology, making them considerably more dangerous than simple thieves or blackmailers. The final confrontation would require not just evidence, but an understanding of motivations that went back decades, to disputes over archaeological ethics and institutional responsibility that had festered in academic obscurity before finding expression through jade envelopes and systematic sabotage. Wolfe emerged from his office carrying the day's orchid selection, arranged the flowers with his usual precision, and settled behind his desk with a satisfied grunt. The case was approaching its climax, but the resolution would require unraveling not just recent criminal activity, but historical grievances that had been carefully nurtured and professionally weaponized by someone who understood that the most effective way to destroy an institution was to turn its own history against its present leadership. Saul Panzer arrived at noon the following day, carrying documentation that connected 15 years of academic grievance to systematic criminal conspiracy. He had located Dr. Leonard Havel in a rent-controlled apartment near Columbia. Subsisting on a modest pension and the kind of bitter satisfaction that comes from nursing decades-old wounds. More significantly, Saul had discovered the Zurich connection that linked Havel directly to the mysterious Herr Kramer persona, a registered business address paid for by a consulting firm that listed Havel as a specialist in cultural heritage rectification services. The financial trail revealed systematic payments from Swiss investment groups over the past 2 years, with activity increasing dramatically 6 months before the first Jade Envelope appeared. Airline records showed Havel had traveled to Lisbon during the same period as Christina Vega's Heritage Conference, though he had flown coach while she traveled business class. The pattern suggested careful coordination between academic expertise and professional criminal methodology. Wolfe listened to the report with the stillness of a mountain contemplating weather changes, then announced his intention to force the final confrontation through psychological rather than legal pressure. He instructed me to type a letter to Dr. Havel, not a summons but an invitation couched as academic courtesy. The text was brief, stating that Nero Wolfe wished to discuss the specific heraldic errors found on the wax seals of the jade envelopes. Errors that a scholar of Dr. Havel's reputation would surely find embarrassing if they became public record in federal indictments. It was precisely the kind of bait that no academic ego could resist, the implication that his intellectual precision, rather than his criminal liability, was under question. The letter went out by messenger at 2 o'clock. And by 4:30 Dr. Havel was standing in our front hall, looking less like a criminal mastermind than a man whom time had worn down to essential elements of pride and resentment. He was thin, with the stooped posture of someone who had spent decades bending over manuscripts, wearing a tweed suit that had gone out of fashion during the Eisenhower administration. He settled into the red leather chair and regarded Wolfe with the mixture of arrogance and wariness that marks deposed royalty visiting a usurper's court. His hands shook slightly, whether from age or anxiety was impossible to determine. Wolfe poured beer, offered none, and began by complimenting Havel on the aesthetic sophistication of the Jade Envelope campaign. The choice of 1930s diplomatic paper was inspired, he observed, evoking exactly the era of institutional founding with appropriate gravitas. However, he continued with the deliberate precision of a surgeon making the first incision. The use of that particular banking family's crest on the wax seal represented a catastrophic historical error that undermined the entire operation's credibility. Havel's face flushed dull red as Wolfe explained that the Institute's founder had famously detested that banking house, having lost a substantial fortune in their crash of '29. The old man would sooner have sealed his correspondence with mud than with their insignia, a fact documented extensively in his private diaries, which were available in the very archive Harville had attempted to destroy. The trap was sprung with mathematical precision. By defending his symbolic choices, Harville admitted authorship of the campaign while simultaneously proving that his vaunted scholarly expertise was compromised by the same carelessness he attributed to his enemies. Wolfe leaned forward, his voice dropping to the register that makes floorboards vibrate, and observed that Harville had sacrificed the scholar's only defense against chaos, absolute precision for theatrical effect that betrayed ignorance of the very history he claimed to champion. Harville gripped the chair arms until his knuckles went white, then launched into a defense that was equal parts confession and manifesto. He spoke of the Institute's founder as a sophisticated thief who had looted the Andes under scientific pretense, of collections built on systematic exploitation, and of the moral necessity of dismantling such structures entirely. The Swiss investors were merely tools, he insisted, a wrecking ball he had hired to demolish corrupt edifices so something ethical could be constructed from the rubble. Wolfe listened without interruption until Harville exhausted his righteous fury, then delivered the kind of intellectual demolition that only someone with his particular combination of erudition and ruthlessness could manage. He observed that there is a profound difference between a surgeon and a butcher, though both use knives to cut flesh. Harville had not attempted to excise corruption through reform. He had arranged for the patient to be murdered and sold for parts. By facilitating theft of the obsidian blade, forging institutional documents, and collaborating with predatory investors, Harville had crossed the line from critic to vandal. The supreme irony, Wolfe noted with visible satisfaction, was that in his zeal to punish the Institute for alleged historical crimes, Harville had committed actual present-day crimes that would ensure his name was erased from academic record entirely. The doorbell rang as Wolfe finished his dissection. Special Agent Loomis was waiting in the front hall as arranged. Harville stood slowly, looking suddenly frail and diminished, stripped of the righteous anger that had sustained him through decades of exile. He looked at Wolfe and asked whether the heraldic error was truly so obvious to any competent scholar. Wolfe replied that to anyone who bothered reading the founder's private papers, it was as glaring as neon signage in a cathedral. After Loomis escorted the defeated professor away, the brownstone settled into silence that felt different from the tension of recent weeks. It was the silence of machinery that has completed its work and is cooling down. I gathered files, notes, and the single jade envelope Wolfe had retained as a specimen, preparing to consign them to the cabinet where closed cases gathered dust. Elena Morrison called at 6 o'clock to report that the board had voted unanimously to retain Nero Wolfe as permanent security consultant, and that the rescheduled symposium would proceed with full disclosure about the attempted acquisition and successful institutional defense. The transparency, she said, would be their best protection against future jade envelopes. Fritz announced dinner with the satisfaction of someone whose schedule had finally returned to proper rhythm. The main course was squab with anchovy toast, requiring delicate timing and precise execution. As we ate, Wolfe was unusually communicative, remarking on the peculiar tragedy of men like Harville, who allow intellect to curdle into resentment until they become the very thing they claim to despise. Intelligence without character, he observed while applying himself to particularly succulent squab, is always dangerous, but intelligence possessed by obsession proves invariably fatal. Harville had spent so many years hating the Institute that he had forgotten why he supposedly loved the artifacts it housed, transforming himself into someone who used culture as a weapon for personal satisfaction rather than a treasure requiring protection. I commented that for someone who disliked leaving his house, Wolfe had traveled remarkably far into human motivation's dark corners without stepping off his own rug. He ignored the observation and reached for his coffee, noting that human nature remains consistent regardless of geography. The same vanity and greed that drive street criminals drive distinguished professors, only with more extensive vocabulary and elaborate rationalizations. The brownstone was secure, the orchids were sleeping, and Nero Wolfe was back where he belonged. Immovable, inscrutable, and entirely satisfied with another demonstration that civilization's enemies, however sophisticated their methods, inevitably defeat themselves through the very pride that motivates their attacks on institutions they can neither understand nor improve. The morning after Havel's arrest brought the kind of crisp November air that makes New York look deceptively civilized, as if the city had decided to dress up for company. I was at my desk by 8:30. Organizing the final paperwork and feeling the particular satisfaction that comes from knowing a complicated case has been wrapped up with all the loose ends properly tied. Wolfe was upstairs with the orchids, presumably explaining to them why they should be grateful not to be involved in international cultural conspiracies. At 10 o'clock, Elena Morrison arrived for the final accounting. She looked like a woman who had walked through a hurricane and emerged with her foundation intact, settling into the red leather chair with the ease of someone who no longer expected the floor to collapse beneath her. She handed me a check that made my eyebrows attempt an escape toward my hairline, covering Wolfe's fee, expenses, and what she called a preservation bonus for saving the Institute's soul, along with its artifacts. When Wolfe descended from the plant rooms, she asked about Martin Ashford's fate. The board was divided between pressing charges and simply firing him for breach of trust. Wolfe considered the question with the gravity of a judge weighing constitutional law, then observed that justice, like cooking, requires proper proportions. Ashford had been weak and foolish, certainly, but he had been manipulated by professionals who specialized in exploiting weakness. Destroying him completely would serve no practical purpose and might seem vindictive, whereas allowing him to resign quietly would remove the risk while preserving institutional dignity. Elena accepted this verdict as if it were legal precedent, explaining that Sophia Brennan had agreed to supervise the archives temporarily, applying her rigorous academic standards to prevent future lapses. The irony that the board member most opposed to commercialization was now guarding against commercial theft was not lost on anyone present. She thanked Wolfe once more and departed into the autumn afternoon, leaving behind the tangible proof of our solvency and the scent of expensive perfume. After she left, Wolfe picked up the single jade envelope he had retained as evidence, holding it to the light and examining the watermark one final time. It was undeniably beautiful, elegant, and distinctive, created to convey history and authority, yet it remained fundamentally a lie wrapped in synthetic sophistication. I asked if he intended to frame it as a trophy. He snorted like a bulldog with respiratory issues and dropped it into the wastebasket, observing that preserving lies, even beautiful ones, was a dangerous habit that led to accepting presentation over substance. I remarked that for a man who claimed to detest exertion, he had done considerable heavy lifting to defend a dead man's reputation. His glare suggested I was deliberately missing the point to annoy him. He said he had not defended a reputation but defended truth itself, because a world where falsehoods establish themselves as facts is a world where he cannot function comfortably. The distinction was apparently crucial to his philosophical framework. I asked why he thought Havel had made the critical error with the banking family's wax seal. Surely a man of his obsessive nature would have verified every detail. Wolfe lowered his book slowly and explained that obsession narrows vision. Havel was so focused on his hatred of the founder that he saw only what he wanted to see, a corrupt capitalist who must have been allied with corrupt bankers. He projected his narrative onto history, and that projection blinded him to reality. It was the common failure of zealots, Wolfe noted. They love their theories more than they respect facts. The telephone rang with a reporter from the Gazette seeking comment on Lascelles' arrest. Wolfe shook his head once, a microscopic movement carrying absolute finality. I told the reporter that Mr. Wolfe had no comment, that the matter was in federal hands, and that inquiries should be directed to the Meridian Institute. When I hung up, Wolfe was already absorbed in his Byzantine administrative history, lips pushing in and out with complete concentration. I settled at my desk to complete the final expense report, typing the last entry. 1 jade envelope, evidentiary value, 0, actual value, 0. Looking at Wolfe, massive and immovable behind his desk, I realized he represented the only institution in the city that could not be sabotaged, bought, or forged. He was the original article, and no amount of synthetic paper or elaborate wax seals could duplicate his particular combination of intellect, stubbornness, and appetite for both truth and exceptional food. The brownstone had returned to its proper rhythm. Orchids upstairs, beer and books downstairs. The systematic defense of civilization one case at a time through the methodical application of intelligence to problems that lesser minds considered insoluble. The check was in the bank, the conspiracy was dismantled, and Nero Wolfe was exactly where he belonged, reading about 10th century administrative problems without having to leave his chair. I pulled the final report from the typewriter, signed it with a flourish, and decided that tonight I would visit the Flamingo Club. After a week of jade envelopes and federal conspiracies, I had a sudden urge to be around people who wore their deception honestly, in sequins and stage makeup, rather than hiding it behind synthetic sophistication and historical grievances. I asked Wolfe if he needed anything else. He turned a page without looking up and said simply, "No, Archie. Good night." "Good night, boss," I replied, grabbing my hat and heading for the door. The case was closed, filed under M for Meridian rather than J for Jade, because as Wolfe had observed, the envelopes were merely wrapping and the real subject was an institution that had nearly sold its soul by installments. It was not a bad way to make a living, defending truth against beautiful lies, especially when the truth paid so handsomely and the lies ended up in the wastebasket where they belonged.